Hello, ladies and gentlemen, students. Thank you for coming along to my last Texts in the City. This has been a series that's gone for all of Terms 1 and Terms 2, and it has been a celebration of the books that you guys will probably hate by the end of the year. But certainly the reason they have made it onto a VCE syllabus is that so many of them are absolute classics or on their way to becoming classics. And it's only in the kind of weary slog of VCE that you can lose perspective on that. And begin to think that some of these texts are actually the millstone around your neck, the sort of the calluses that maybe Thornhill felt as he rode across that river, that cold river, before his transportation. It does feel a bit that way, but the year does end, and these great art forms endure. And so this series is about celebrating these pieces of art and hopefully being able to convey some of our enjoyment in the text to you guys as students. My name's Tony Wilson. Your theme today is conflict. We won't necessarily only be talking about conflict. We're going to be talking about why we like The Secret River, if we do. But I'm a novelist, as is my guest, and I'll tell you that conflict, there's absolutely no point in writing anything without conflict. Conflict is momentum in a story, and you can't think of one film out there or one book that contains no conflict, because conflict is the stuff of stories. And so in some ways you've got a fairly easy theme, in the sense that you'll be able to find conflict at almost every level of everything you study. And so for me to say there's conflict between the settlers and the indigenous people in this book, there's conflict within Thornhill's family, there's conflict between the settlers, there's conflict between the English, the upper class English and the people that push them across rivers, there's conflict between the new government in New South Wales and the settlers, there's just conflict everywhere, because you can't really write about that time of Australia's history without there being conflict anywhere, and it wouldn't be a good book if you didn't find the conflict. So that's my early sermon. Having got it out, I'm going to introduce our special guest. Tony Birch, Dr. Tony Birch, is a writer and historian. He also works as a curator and collaborator with artists. He publishes in the area of history, short fiction and essays, and his books, his wonderful Shadowboxing was released by Scribe in 2006, and if you want to read a great book set in inner city Melbourne, that is a great book. Father's Day, Hunter Publishers 2009, and his most recent exhibition was called Camp Pell Lecture at Art Space in Sydney in 2010, and this year 2011, Queensland University Press slated to release his next book, which is called Blood. Please put your hands together for Tony Birch. Would you like to add anything to my diatribe on conflict? Do you find it quite useful in your stories, Tony?
Well, I would reiterate the same point. Clearly in Secret River it's everywhere and between different groups of people, and I think that, yeah, when you write a story, it's whether you resolve it or whether you build to it. Clearly, for me, conflict's a part of everything I write, but partly I think it gives us a greater understanding of the human condition. I've been reading a lot of novels the last few weeks for the Victorian Premier's Award, and I think the ones that strike you as invigorating are ones that do excite you because of the emotional lift that you get through that interaction between characters. And books and stories that don't work is there's a flatness to them when you don't have that emotional engagement, and conflict does deliver that.
In terms of whether I like this book, I'll go so far as to say I think it's pretty much the best Australian book I read over the last 5 or 6 years. What I love about this book is that most story, I often wonder, because it's easy to judge people that behave in what would be regarded as, you know, kind of a base or aggressive or violent way now, and especially where it's racial violence involved. These are very charged issues, and you think, I am a better person than that, and I look down on the people who inflict racial violence and who are racist. You know, there's been a celebrated footballer who's got 4 weeks suspension, and rightly there's a bit of community outrage, even though as a society I would also argue that we're quite racist. But the skill of this book, I think, is to make me feel through a character. You're going to like this guy, you're going to ride with this guy, and yet you're going to experience what was a pervasive violence around that time. And for me to feel as though it may have been me, or that it would have taken immense willpower to not be dragged into this conflict was, I think, a huge achievement, and to do it with such beautiful prose and terrific story momentum as well makes this one of my favourite books. Tony, what was your reaction to The Secret River in a kind of a global sense?
Well, I think to take up what you've just talked about, I mean, one is that you don't want to lessen or justify the impact of either racism or violence in the book, but what you do want to do, I suppose, is get a sense of its complexity. So if you were to take that notion of, putting yourself in this situation, I think that what we get through the character of Thornhill is a real dilemma or a real desire, which tears at him in a sense, because he witnesses acts of racism and violence towards Indigenous people that are abhorrent to them, but at the same time he has this desire for freedom, he has this desire for independence, which he certainly didn't have in England as growing up in that poor working class area, and he certainly didn't have as a convict. But as a man who's been given his ticket of leave, it fits that notion of he wants to be one of those self-made men, free of that class hierarchy of British society. But to do that, I mean, what the terrible act of violence that we lead up to is for him to do that. It's going to come at a terrible cost, and that is the cost of not only the lives of Indigenous people, but the land and culture of Indigenous people. So I think Grenville deals with that dilemma quite well, so that we are then put in a position where we must ask questions of ourselves, ask questions of colonial society, and not have a simple response to it, which is one of the ways that you talk about, Tony, is to say, well, that was then, this is now sort of thing, which would be a very simplistic and a misleading way to consider it. So what really impressed me about the book is that I think it does put us as the readers on the spot, that we have to deal with these complexities to really try and come to some understanding of the way that colonial violence operates. And a lot of people in contemporary society don't do that. So I feel that's the great success of the book. And having said that, as a fiction writer, as Tony is also, you don't want to be too didactic or too instructional to your readers. It's still told through a great story. This is great storytelling. And I think if you can combine great storytelling with the complexity of questions that we need to ask ourselves as readers, I think it's a real successful outcome.
If we go back to the start of the book, possibly one of the most overlooked parts of the book is the England section, just because this has become such a text about, I guess, the politics of settlement. But the England part of the book's really important to me, and I thought just as high a standard as the rest of the book as well, because in creating a sympathetic character, you needed to kind of have the barrage that is England, and it really gives a taste of what was a genuinely different world, and an incredibly classist world, and an incredibly difficult world. And I think I mentioned the blisters in my opening monologue there. But you really do feel his pain out there on the river, don't you? What do you think the first section of the book serves? And what were your reactions to that?
Well, I think the first reaction was that I teach writing now, but I taught history for many years at Melbourne University, and I was always intrigued by the way that we would sort of separate and compartmentalise what we call British history and Australian history. And what I taught Australian history and Aboriginal history, as it was called, and what I would try and impart to students is to think of that, what we call the early colonial period in Australia. It has a link, not only a link, it cannot be understood exclusive of British history at the same time. So I think that when we look at the experience of those early convicts or early so-called free settlers coming to what became Australia, we have to understand the set of circumstances, the politics, the economics, the belief systems that they brought with them. So one of the things that we understand from that first section of the book is that here is a man who comes from an incredibly brutal society. Even though we have a sort sort of a civil British society against a so-called savage society of Indigenous Australians, there's that scene early in the book where he witnesses that terrible public hanging.
Yeah.
Him and his son are witness to that public hanging that goes terribly wrong. We are witness to events which themselves are quite violent and quite brutal, and some of that brutality is transported to Australia through both the treatment of convicts and then the way the Crown, through occupation in Australia, in a sense allows those so-called free settlers and ticket of leave convicts to go out into the hinterland and in a way occupy the land for them. So it is a story of pretty much institutional violence that we need to understand psychologically to get a sense of what those early years of occupation are like.
Yeah, that's courtroom scene as well. Like, I think that there is that sense from the government in New South Wales that they are the civilisers, and obviously that even that language that's used throughout the Secret River of savages on one side, and civilisation is here, and it's the way that Thornhill's wife's always thinking as well, that civilisation is back home, and yet you think of that courtroom scene and it's almost an aside as he fumbles with his cap, and it's absolute that no one cares that a death sentence is being pronounced, and that is brilliantly rendered. One of the things that novelists try to do is to create detail and to create noise in the book so that it feels real. And I think Grenville's courtroom scene there in London, where she describes, I think, almost a pit that's full of people, and the judge is kind of elevated up above them, and the gallery's back there, and you can kind of hear what's Thornhill's wife's name again? Having a moment of blank. He thinks he can hear Sal yelling out.
Thank you.
And she gets all that noise, and even the detail on the black cap slipping off. He's going to be doing 9 other executions for the day. And that for me is that's a society that's in trouble. And so when the English cricket crowds yell at us about being a convict society, well, we can come up with some very complicated and uncatchy cries back at them about what sort of a society they were to send us here. Tony, I'm sorry I've gone on. What about the actual politics? There was some furore when this book was written, of course. Could you talk us through that? The politics of this book.
There are 2 issues, and I said to Tony beforehand, I don't want to bore you with detail. The problem with being an academic historian, you can go on and on forever and put people to sleep very quickly. The 2, pretty simply though, there are 2 issues, and one is the one that would interest both of us, and that is that should fiction writers be telling history? And of course fiction writers are always telling history, but in regard to this, there was a sort of a turf war around Grenville's book that she's a novelist, she's not a historian, therefore we have to understand that this is made up as opposed to factual history. So there are professional historians and academic historians who took it to task over that. That's one issue, and the other one of course is equally controversial, and that is the one about a non-Aboriginal or non-Indigenous writer writing Indigenous characters, which is also a perennial one. Just a quick response on both. I think that for me it's not... I'm not that interested in whether this is more factual than professional history. I think the fact is we've got a novelist here who teases out the very issues that we should be concerned about as a contemporary society, and she teases out issues of Australia's past that should interest us greatly, and I think she does that magnificently. So I don't pick Secret River up and saying, well, this is a definitive history, but nor do I pick it up and think, well, this is simply fiction that I'm not going to take seriously as a evocation of the past. I think we need to take it very seriously, and alongside other texts then we can make a sort of create an impression of a past for ourselves. So I think it's a very serious book at that level. In regard to non-Aboriginal writers writing Aboriginal characters, I have a view which maybe is not a PC view, and I think it's a redundant discussion. I think it's more important that we try and promote the more potential for younger Indigenous people to write and get a better education and be available to readers. So that my response always to this is, if you think there's an issue about getting stories of the past about Indigenous people from Indigenous people, well, do all that you can to support young Indigenous people getting the opportunity to do that, and then you'll have a greater body of work from both Indigenous and non-Indigenous writers. So that's more important. I think for all of us, I've got teenage children in high school, and for me this is a definitive text to pick up and try and unpick some of those issues of early Australia that these are really important conversations for us to have, and I think she does that magnificently.
Just in terms of the history, the novelisation of history, Grenville doesn't talk about this representing a particular massacre or a particular incident on the Hawkesbury. I think she did find a Thornhill, didn't she? And I'm not sure if I didn't read the author note at the back, but I'm not sure if his name was Thornhill or whether she changed that. But certainly she did a lot of time in the archives. And at the time she wrote the book, it's actually quite an illustrative book of Australia's culture wars as well, because in 2005, heart of the Howard era here in Australia, and the rise of some academic historians that Tony would have locked horns with over the years, like Keith Windshuttle, that started doing a body-by-body count of the deaths of Indigenous Australians, particularly I think in Tasmania, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And this was, I think, a pretty dark time in Australian academia, and this book kind of contributed, I guess, in a very accessible mainstream way to a particular view of what contact was like. And it wasn't the Windshuttle view, which is that a bit of disease came to Australia and some blackfellas died.
It's interesting also, I think, that on the other side is that I was involved in some of those debates and then sort of withdrew from because I found them less than energetic. And I think the other issue, though, which is important to this book, is that on the other side, and being a historian who's done a lot of research in this area, it's absolutely, from my research and my knowledge, it's without question that many Aboriginal people were killed on the frontier by non-Aboriginal people, documented by non-Aboriginal people in government documents. But I think that what the other side of that debate came down to what I would call sort of a crude body count. And I think that what this book does is that rather than simply think, or make claims to how many people may have died, and I mean simply numbers in each place, this is really, again, about the complexity of the interactions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people and some of the circumstances that led to these confrontations and the conflict that people here are interested in. So rather than just think, okay, this is a numbers count, this is really about human interaction and the disastrous outcomes of that. So again, I think it's a real quality of the book. The only thing that I sort of would hesitate around, not so maybe as a historian, is that there's, I think, a little too much neatness of that sort of outcome of this book, in the sense that you have Thornhill, who is a convict, free man, has land, has interaction with Aborigines. He's faced with this dilemma. Then you get this murder or death of one white man, and then you get this horrific massacre, and then a sort of dispersal of Indigenous people. And that, in a sense, within a novel there's only so much of a story you can tell, but I suppose the one thing I'd want to impart with students in particular is that history of what we might call frontier conflict is itself much more complex than that. Now, we can't expect Grenville to do everything in the one book, but I would say that's where I'd say that this book is important, but also a book that you need to look at in context with other readings and other histories. So I would suggest that, and I'm sure that students do this, where you look at other texts around the same issue, because you do get a much more complex story. I mean, there is the Blackwood character who goes and lives upriver. I think he's, for me, the most interesting character in the book, because in a way his interaction with Indigenous people, he has a common law wife or an Aboriginal woman who he's living with. They have a child. He makes that statement, you give a little if you're going to take a little, and he decides not to encroach any further on land and has this sort of just this small homestead at the sort of edge almost of Aboriginal country. I think he's such an interesting character because in his interaction with the Indigenous people of that area around the Hawkesbury, he, one, shows the potential for another way of interaction, but also the cost of that, because he's despised himself by many of the settler community because not only of his acceptance of his place in an Aboriginal landscape rather than vice versa, clearly his cohabitation with an Aboriginal woman, but I was really taken by Grenville's portrayal of that character and his place in this story. And I think something about his character really engaged me, as if I were teaching this text, it would be he's a great character to engage students with the potential for other outcomes. Because what we're dealing with, I think, in contemporary Australia is how can we interact differently? Now, you're talking about this horrific incident of racism in AFL that's been in the press in the last day or so. We know that there are enormous still difficulties and conflict around interaction between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and I think his character is one of those historical models that shows us a way forward. And I probably could contextualise this just briefly. As a historian, I do a lot of archival research myself. When people talk about something like reconciliation, which can be a sort of vacuous word, one of the things that I like to teach as a teacher is say, okay, I can show you the interaction between an Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal man in Victoria in the late 19th century who found equity in their relationship, and I'm talking about an Aboriginal man called William Barrack and a non-Aboriginal man called John Green, who was the manager of Corranderk Aboriginal Reserves, and these men had great respect for each other. So one of the things, whether it be done in fiction through Grenville or done by going to the archive, we can find relationships in the past where people did try and find another way to engage each other. So the Blackwood character in this book is not a fantasy. He's not a 20th... It's not Grenville's sort of reconciliation fantasy. People did find ways to interact differently, so we've got to look at that as the potential for a more positive outcome, I think.
And she puts different... It's almost like there's a scale of abhorrence we should feel. And Blackwood, as you say, is on the... he's on the... At the far end of tolerance and understanding, and then Thornhill's sort of somewhere in the middle, and that brilliant scene that's written in his first stressful. You can imagine just arriving on the Hawkesbury and beginning to dig your corn plot and seeing that something's been kind of turned over there, but the black fellas, they didn't do any farming, so it can't be them. And then there's the confrontation after he's pulled up there. I'm not sure exactly what they were, some sort of tubers, I guess. Yams. So they've been pulled up, and clearly the Indigenous guys are mainly upset about him having pulled up their food. And also probably there's a growing sadness about what's happening as more and more people arrive. But maybe the initial confrontation is about that food, and yet he's so unable to get inside their world that I don't think Thornhill even thinks for a moment that it's the pulling up of the yams that has created this conflict. He thinks it's their arrival and potentially that they want the spades, or potentially that they want to kill them, and he wishes he had brought mirrors and beads, and he's a fair way off track, and you wonder whether Blackwood would have done a fair bit better in that initial confrontation. And then, of course, at the very far end of Grenville's spectrum is Smasher, who's just a pig. And so you've got...
Write that down. I mean,
that's the right answer, by the way.
I mean, I think that's interesting because what he comes with a very narrow or an ignorant set of beliefs and circumstances, attitudes around the savage, quote unquote, and he's puzzled. Like, there's that wonderful scene toward the end where the same old man who he'd sort of pushed around and sort of sees as sort of in a way a pathetic sort of old man in this group of Indigenous men, he sees him dancing and painted up toward the end, and he sees vitality and strength in this man by witnessing this, and it shocks Thornhill. And I think that stands for me as what you get is a lack of social interaction between people that doesn't allow you to expose stereotypes. Now, I think this is as relevant in Australia in the early 19th century as it is in Australia in the 21st century. If the only image, the only knowledge we have of people is based on a stereotype, and a very negative stereotype, that's the way we're going to act toward them. Even if we're liberal-minded, we think that this is not us. We tend to, when we meet people of a different culture who we only have a perception of through the media, is that we engage with them in, at best, a patronising way. I mean, if you look at, go back to where you came from, I mean, what people are confronted with is their own ignorance. And I think that in that documentary, it's when people become exposed to the humanity of people, they really have to start questioning all those beliefs. And I think that it's something that comes to Thornhill gradually, but the tragedy, of course, is that you have these careering beliefs. One is that he certainly wants to engage with people in a different way, but at the same time, there's his own desire for land, and then you have this confrontation which comes out of the death of this white man. So in the case of Blackwood, we don't know the circumstances that led him to shift, but we do know they're there. And again, if you look at historically here in Victoria, material that I've worked on, I've documented similar circumstances where there have been, usually where it has been forced upon settlers to look at an Aboriginal person differently, that it's been an awakening. And usually it's been someone like William Buckley who doesn't have a choice. If William Buckley, when he escaped from Sullivan's Cove in 1804, had not interacted with Wurundjeri people, he would have died. Joseph Tice Gellibrand, a famous story of a man who sails a boat from Van Diemen's Land across Bass Strait and lands at French Island in 1836, and then decides, as any silly Englishman does, it's a hot day in January, I'll just walk to Melbourne, and quickly finds himself both starving to death and dehydrated. He is saved by Bunurong men. They save his life with water and food. He's a man at the start of his journey who writes in his diary in a very demeaning way about these savages, in the way that we would expect someone like Smasher to react. At the end of that same journey, when he has been reliant on those men and women for hospitality, for his sustenance, for his life, he writes about them in a very different way, in a much more respectful and informed way. And I think that what the tragedy of Thornhill, or the circumstances in Secret River, are that the potential for that is there. He begins to become aware of something different, but it is lost. And I think you have that. When you think about conflict in colonial society, that is really the tragedy. Some people are like Smasher, who act with violence and wanton violence. They are, in a sense, supported by the state, and the state is sort of absent from the frontier, but the state, in fact, endorses this. Yeah, these people go out and plant their corn, then they have that claim to land, and then you'll have a hold on it. So this violence is sanctioned at a government level, and then you have individuals like Thornhill who, as they're attempting to engage in a different way, it is disrupted by these acts of colonial violence. So in that sense, it is incredibly tragic because the opportunity is lost.
It's interesting, you mentioned hunger for land in Thornhill. I think that's one of the other great triumphs of the book, that in this character, the human nature is captured in William Thornhill, that the England bit exists to create the canvas on which this love and hunger for land can be painted, because you sort of understand, why wouldn't he feel this? This is his one chance, and we've had 110 pages of saturation as to why this guy does deserve a chance, and just to feel, and that also sets up his conflict with Sal in that middle section of the book, where, or in the early to middle section, where she wants to go back and he still has his eye on this land, and at the same time she's eyeing off the big conflict to come, which is between Thornhill and the indigenous population, or Thornhill and other settlers with the indigenous population, because if they all feel the same as he does, if they've all been released from this very classist society to have their one opportunity, then we as readers are meant to kind of, I guess, not sympathise or condone, but to at least have a complex view on what happens towards the end of that book. I thought we're going to go to questions in a few moments, but I guess just some closing remarks, Tony.
Buy my book when it comes out in October. No, look, I think that my closing remark would be that I would hope that students would look at a book like this in a way that both gets you to ask questions about colonial society in a way that maybe you hadn't considered before. But I honestly do think it's a book to consider your relationships with different cultures today. Not only, again, Indigenous cultures, but I don't know your backgrounds, but maybe a mainstream culture that you're not part of. And I think that it's about, if you want to interact with people in a way that is equitable, it's about social interaction. It's about witnessing someone's humanity, and that's what is missing for so many characters in this book and for British society, is not to witness humanity in Indigenous people, and that's the real tragedy.
Thanks, Tony. We are going to questions at 5:05, and we've got 10 minutes, so put your hand up and a microphone will migrate your way.
Just down the front there.
I just wondered, from a historical perspective, how accurate the character of Smasher Sullivan actually is.
Well, I thought about, believe it or not, I thought about that quite seriously when I was reading the book on both occasions. Is that I've done a lot of work on the Western District of Victoria at a comparable time of the earliest occupation. So we're talking about the early 19th century, when the Henty brothers came across illegally from Van Diemen's Land, came off a boat at a place what became Portland, and really had a hold on that land before British justice officials came in the 1830s. What I would say is that there was a very similar level of quite extreme violence. When George Augustus Robinson comes through there as the first Chief Protector of Aborigines and interviews police magistrates, constables, etc., the record of violence that he enters into his diaries, which I've read, is really a trail of shocking violence, particularly the murder and rape of Aboriginal women, as witnessed by, again, representatives of the Crown. So there's not a sort of this is not a folk tale or an oral history. This is documented history. So when you think about the level of violence, I think in that sense it's tragically accurate. I think maybe, I don't know if it's in the question, but maybe though I think there is something that does sort of, it's a bit abrasive for me, is that what I hope that readers of this book wouldn't feel is that those who enacted the greatest crimes against Aboriginal people were these sort of homicidal, marginalised or psychopathic individuals. Now, while there are instances of that occurring, what we need to note is that the Henty brothers, who were clearly involved in the murder of Aboriginal people, again as documented by Europeans, were part of the landed gentry. They ended up becoming members of Parliament. They have, whole towns and seats in Parliament named after them. So I think if we consider those who commit acts of violence against Aboriginal, sort of rogue, sort of brutish individuals, that's not an accurate interpretation of those involved in violence, and of course those who sanction violence. So in that sense, it's not accurate. The violence itself, unfortunately, is, I think, very accurate.
Another question.
Just a bit of context. When Sal got sick and had to go back to the main township, and the doctor refused to see her because she was a convict wife, how much was that true between the conflict between the conflict settlers and the authorities who were, for Queen and Country?
Okay, do you want to have a go at that?
Well,
I'm happy to, but
I'm not a historian. I did third year history in my arts degree, so I'm obviously very well qualified to speak on anything about history. But I think I might go to the doctor over here.
Okay.
Yes.
If you want to ask a question about the AFL, Tony's the expert.
Oh no. Or about what you can learn in law in 190 days as a solicitor.
I think that one of the things that I was, again, thinking about as I read the novel is, and I'll go directly to the question, but it was what's called the Master and Servants Acts, which were central to the administration of justice in Australia from the very early days of occupation until trade unions became active in the 1890s. And both convicts, even ticket of leave convicts, and their families, their relationship with colonial authorities was based on what you might call summary justice. So that a similar notion to this is when Thornhill goes back to Sydney to pick out those two convicts who are going to work with him, and he's suddenly treated as a convict again, or treated as lower class, is that treatment that Sal meets with would depend. It's very individualised, unfortunately, so there are no set circumstances or set of legal rules or obligations in the way that authorities would deal with the families of convicts or ex-convicts. But what you find is that, in fact, individuals within colonial authority deal with individuals like Sal in very different ways. If you go through the Master and Servants Act cases where servants, that is convicts and workers and their families, bring cases to the court against masters, you'll find that the interaction with authorities can be very different. Some treat them very harshly and very brutally and dismissively, as is that case, and some have a more, I suppose, paternalistic relationship with ex-convicts, where you would say that their treatment or their engagement is not an equal one, but it is one where there is certainly a level of respect. So to answer the question, there would be circumstances where individual authorities would deal with people as if they were still slaves themselves or they still had no rights themselves, and others would deal with them in a more benevolent way. But in the end, the authority with the colonial authority was unquestioned. So that people were treated in very harsh and brutal ways that we would consider extremely unjust today, around basic rights of wages, meal breaks, food, etc. So there is a very classist-based society still operating in Australia, despite sort of ideas to the contrary.
A role of women in the secret history. I guess the biggest female character in the book is Sal, and she's drawn from very early on to a long way through, and she is, I guess, I mean, it is that frontier world is kind of mapped out in the male mind, I guess, because it sort of was the physicality of building houses and cutting down trees and whatever seems to belong to what would have then been perceived as the male role. Sal, I think, is a really well realised character. If I was a novelist and I could draw a female character as well as Sal, I'd be pretty happy. What's your reaction to her and what role do you think she fulfills in The Secret River?
Look, I think Sal is generally well composed. She's strong, lively, occasionally lusty. I think that the question, though, is more pertinent to the portrayal of Aboriginal women in the book. And I think that it's one of the other problems, well, I think it is a problem in the book, so that you have this scene where an Aboriginal woman is literally chained up by Smasher, and you really have a sense of Aboriginal women being completely powerless in the book. Now, that does not... And even when Thornhill's witnessing interaction between Aboriginal people, it's mainly male-centred. Now, I can say again from work I've done on Victoria is that, just to give you a little sort of response to this, is that the first documented interaction between a non-Aboriginal person and Aboriginal people in Victoria of any substance is when John Batman first comes to shore in 1835 at what becomes Indented Head and attempts to find a group of Aboriginal men to sign his sort of bogus treaty, when in fact the first group of Aboriginal people he meets are a group of 40 Aboriginal women hunting with their children, independent completely of men, great knowledge of land, great interaction with landscape, and when Batman tries to interact with these women and give them some trinkets and beads, which he does, they give him some very valuable Wurundjeri implements. One's called a tarnuk, which is an ornamental water bowl, and they give this to Batman. He's very confused about this exchange, and I don't want to go into the detail, but it is an exchange of what's called tandarum in Wurundjeri society, of an exchange of gifts where the visitor leaves with something of greater value than they offer you, so that you owe them nothing in a sense. And I think that what people would often be surprised about if they don't know much about pre-contact Indigenous communities is that women have a very central role and a very independent role in their community, and none of that I don't think is conveyed in this book. So I think that's a real absence. And of course then the other thing is we only know the women as victims. Now, it's not to suggest that they're not victim of some atrocious violence, but if we only know any group of people as victims, again, we don't know them we don't know the humanity. So certainly it would be, for me, an absence in this book would be that lack of understanding of the full potential and the role of women in society. Having said that, and I've said this as a historian many times, I think that, if we look at the mistreatment, abuse of any group of people in Australian history, I don't think there's any more abused group of people in Australian history than Aboriginal women, by the state, by individuals, etc. So you've got to try and put those things into context.
Yeah, no, well, it's interesting you say that I would have defended Grenville by saying that the book isn't set in Indigenous communities at the time of settlement. It's set in Thornhill's life at the time of settlement, and that he has a fleeting moments and a sense of the Indigenous world around him, but he is not in it, and therefore that's her excuse to say she's not going to give a full view of Indigenous life or a fully rounded view of Indigenous life. She's going to do the bits where Indigenous life come to Thornhill, and it might have been that men were the predominant, but from what Tony says there, it sounds just as realistic that women may have made some of those incursions or more of those incursions. Any other questions? We've probably got time for one more.
I had a student last year who, in an essay, wrote about how in the Secret River the conflict transcends the page and makes its way right into the heart of the reader. That is, there's something we're left with as a reader. We're left with a conflict in our hearts, or a conflict in our hearts becomes stronger, more real. The whispering becomes louder. If you could pin that down, if you could sum it up, what would that conflict be, do you think? What is the conflict this raises in us? What's the conflict that this sets fire to in our hearts?
Well, from my perspective, firstly, I hope the student got a good mark. That's a great way to end an essay. I really do think that, and this is a big issue that we don't have time to talk about here, I think the conflict in our hearts is that these issues cannot be resolved simply. They cannot be resolved before they're resolved. In other words, that conflict and those questions need to be understood within us and certainly discussed amongst us. So that, and again, I don't want to get on a big political soapbox, although I love a big political soapbox. It would be to say something like the federal government's apology to the stolen generations. If that's the beginning to a discussion, I think it's a appropriate gesture. If it's the end of a discussion, it's not an appropriate gesture. And I think what that student is alluding to is that we like to, I think for ourselves, just think about conflict. We like within us, we want conflict resolved, don't we? It makes us feel uneasy, whether we're arguing with our brother or sister, our parent, someone down the street, or something like this. We want conflict resolved, most of us. And I think that this conflict cannot be easily resolved. It's not settled. It is unfinished business. So I think that tension within us at the conclusion of a book like this is that it's saying to us, we must address these questions. Now, I teach at a university, and I think what I can differentiate between inquisitive students and those who are less inquisitive are those who, when you prod them to, and you open up these questions, those who respond in a way that they want to deal with these issues are the students who write those sort of essays, and those who find conflict uneasy or say, oh, I don't want to really deal with this question, or I thought we dealt with this in the apology, tend to produce responses which are less exciting, less courageous, and less adventurous. So I think what the book is doing, if it's giving those sort of responses from a student, I think that shows great maturity in that student who's willing and ready to deal with those questions that are being asked of the student. And one of my favourite academics at my university used to say, and I think this applies to secondary school, if you don't want to face the difficult questions, you should not be at university. And I think education is about facing and attempting to deal with the difficult questions in society, and that's what the book is doing.
And I also think that was a wonderful answer and question. The thing that makes me ache about this book is what I kind of opened with, I guess, at the start, which is that we're all at the centre of our own universe. We are selfish individuals. Humans kind of have to be, and it's always an effort to not be selfish. And what I think this book does, as well as any book, is to give us a very long, slow illustration of a man who we at least empathise with, and on so many levels he has done his best. And for us to watch him go down the Hawkesbury and have success, there's some joy you take in Thornhill having some success because of how hard he's done it, and all the qualities that we're meant to admire in this world. Thornhill demonstrates so many of them. And time and again, when he sees, as Tony said, when he sees Smash's behaviour, he's horrified. Time and again, he shows himself to be a moral person. And yet, the fact that Thornhill can be involved in what happens says, what would I have been like? Am I as good a person as Thornhill? How would I go then, and how will I go now? Because, as Tony says, these are continuing issues, and it's only really I guess the fact that Indigenous Australia suffered to the extent it did, and that numerically we don't have the sort of situation that's in New Zealand, where Indigenous culture is just numerically doesn't have the boost that, say, it does in New Zealand. That a lot of Australian society glides over the top of this problem because numerically we're not presented with it, and it's tucked away. And so I guess what it makes me think about is, first of all, I'm isolated from this problem and I don't engage with it. So what sort of a person does that make me? And it makes me wonder, when push comes to shove and it's my self-interest presented against this, I would argue, immoral position to take these immoral steps, how will I go? And the fact that the book poses that scenario so brilliantly makes it, I think, one of the better books that's been written in Australian history. That brings us to the end of this session. The woman who wrote this book, Kate Grenville, is going to be here at the Wheeler Centre, presented by the Wheeler Centre, at least during the Melbourne Writers Festival. So on Monday the 29th of August at 4:30 p.m. till 5:15, Text in the City is resuming here at the Wheeler Centre, but this time it's going to be with the actual authors involved of the texts. And the three that are being featured are Kate Grenville, The Secret River, that's Monday the 29th. Tuesday the 30th is Alice Pung and Growing Up Asian in Australia. And Thursday the 1st of September, Peter Goldsworthy and Maestro. So if you'd like to come along and hear the authors themselves speak, book for those. That brings me to the end of a wonderful involvement with this program. Thank you very much. It's been a joy. Also, if you could put your hands together for Tony Birch and